Hey guys, tonight we wander into a sound so old that even silence feels like an echo. Picture yourself walking through a medieval abbey long after Compline, when the candles burn down to their last trembling pearls of light, and the air hums with something you can't quite name. The monks have gone to their cells, but the vaulted stone above still remembers their voices, their chants spiraling upward like slow smoke from an unseen fire. You stand at the threshold of that sound, wrapped in your cloak, trying not to breathe too loudly, because in this kind of hush even your pulse seems like percussion. Somewhere deep inside these walls a single tone lingers, a low vibration that might be faith or might be something else entirely. Hey, you probably won't survive this, at least not without goosebumps. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing the little constellation of glowing screens across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk farther down the nave, each footstep answered by a small, patient echo, as though the building itself is curious about your presence. In the 12th century, chant was not just music, it was believed to be a ladder to heaven, one rung per note. Monks like Guido of Arezzo, you can thank him for inventing the modern staff notation, believed sound was a divine geometry, proof that God had arranged the cosmos in harmony. But the same harmonies that opened heaven's gate were rumored to shake loose whatever slumbered below it. The abbey you're standing in was once home to a group of Cistercian monks who swore that during certain night offices they heard voices responding to their psalms, notes that didn't come from any human throat. Mainstream historians call it auditory resonance, fringe accounts call it the choir beneath. One chronicler described hearing the counterpoint of the dead, low, breathy tones rising from under the crypt floor whenever the chant reached its highest pitch. Skeptics say it was simply the acoustics of barrel vaults amplifying subterranean air currents. Believers say it was the souls of unshriven monks keeping time in purgatory. You pause beside a pillar streaked with wax, tracing the cold grooves where centuries of fingers have fidgeted through prayer. The air tastes like iron and dust. A bat flutters by, startled from sleep, its wings slicing through the silence like an exclamation mark. You half expect it to keep rhythm. The abbey's layout was engineered for sound, not beauty. Every curve, every arch tuned to make a voice last just a breath longer than it should. Imagine a choir of 50 monks singing in unison. The harmonics bounce, merge, and thicken until the air becomes syrupy with tone. You can almost feel it pressing against your skin, that dense acoustic fog. Modern acousticians who've studied similar cathedrals found that certain frequencies, especially around 110 Hz, trigger mild disorientation, a kind of holy dizziness. Some psychologists even suggest that religious ecstasy might partly be an auditory illusion, the brain's way of interpreting vibration as transcendence. Yet one record from the Abbey's archives hints at something more curious. A marginal note in Latin, written beside a psalm notation, reads, Vox alta revocat umbras. The high voice recalls the shadows. No one knows who wrote it. It might have been a bored scribe, or it might have been a warning. There's a legend that one winter, during matins, the cantor struck a pitch so pure the walls themselves trembled, and the abbey bell in the courtyard began to ring though no rope pulled it. Snow fell from the rafters like shaken dust, and several novices fled, swearing they saw figures standing in the transept, pale and listening. A century later, the story still survived in local taverns, told with that smirk peasants reserve for monks who pretend not to drink. You can't help smiling. Of course, medieval people blamed ghosts. They blamed ghosts for everything from spoiled wine to hiccups. But even now, as you listen, there's a note you can't unhear, the residue of centuries vibrating like a slow heartbeat beneath the stones. You wonder if the line between music and haunting was ever real, or if it was always just a matter of who or what was listening. You lean against the wall, the chill of limestone climbing your sleeve, and think, maybe that's the real magic of medieval music. It doesn't summon spirits, it convinces you they were already here, waiting for a song to remember them by. You move deeper into the abbey's memory, where the air grows thick with the ghost of sound, and somewhere in that thickness hides what musicians once called diabolus in musica, the devil's interval. It's not a demon in a cloak, not a chord that bursts into flame when struck. It's something quieter and far more unsettling, two notes that refuse to get along. The tritone, 3 whole steps apart, was the musical equivalent of rubbing wool and amber until the sparks fly, a tension that medieval theorists found so intolerable they called it unnatural. You stand by a cracked lectern where a missal lies open to a psalm, its notation curling like ivy. The scribes who copied these scores weren't just copying pitches, they were replicating boundaries between sacred and profane sound. In the 12th century, the Church warned composers against the tritone's use, not because it summoned actual demons, at least officially not, but because it fractured the ordered harmony believed to mirror divine perfection. And if heaven was perfect order, then this interval was chaos whistling through the cracks. You hum it softly, F to B, and the vibration runs up your throat like static. Somewhere in the distance, something wooden creaks and you laugh under your breath, because of course it does. Modern physicists would tell you the discord arises from clashing overtones, the ear's inability to resolve competing frequencies. But for medieval monks, that dissonance felt moral, not mathematical. A reminder that sin didn't need lyrics to be heard. There's one real documented case from 1322, in a small Benedictine monastery near Mainz, where a choirmaster named Brother Conrad was accused of introducing unlicensed intervals during Vespers. The abbot's report says that during his performance, candles quivered, dogs outside howled, and one novice fainted. Today we'd chalk it up to drafty windows and suggestion, but his punishment, 3 months of silence, suggests his audience heard something they couldn't explain. And here's your historical fact for the night. Pope Gregory IX actually issued a formal statement banning certain corrupt forms of chant, though he never mentioned the tritone by name. Scholars still argue whether that edict had musical intent or was a metaphor about heresy. Either way, the devil's interval slipped through history like a rumor you can't stop humming. You picture Brother Conrad in the candlelight, testing forbidden notes when no one's listening, curious whether disobedience could sound beautiful. Maybe it did. Maybe that's the real reason he scared them. Because it was beautiful. The fringe historians, the ones who live for conferences with words like acoustic necromancy, claim the tritone vibrates close to the resonant frequency of human bone, meaning prolonged exposure could cause mild vertigo or trance. No, you're not going to test that. You like your bones unshaken. Still, the idea tickles something deep in you. If sound can move matter, if it can make stone quiver and air shimmer, who's to say it can't thin the veil between things? There's even a medieval debate, revived by modern scholars, about whether music existed before the fall of man, that maybe Adam's first sin was striking the wrong note. The texts contradict themselves. Theologians argued that Eden's music was pure intervals only, perfect fifths and octaves, no tension at all. Which raises a tantalizing question. Don't worry, I'm not asking you to answer. Maybe what we call evil in music is just the sound of humanity becoming self-aware. You glance toward the choir stalls, and imagining the monks who spent lifetimes chasing purity while secretly craving that one wrong interval, the one that made their hearts stutter. You can almost hear them, centuries of hands trembling on the same note, wondering if the echo that answered back was divine reprimand or delighted applause. And as the air trembles around you now, it's hard to tell whether you're standing in a house of prayer or inside the world's oldest amplifier tuned to catch whatever wants to sing through you next. You leave the cold geometry of the abbey behind and follow the sound of something lighter. rising from a garden that smells of crushed sage and wet stone. And there she is, or at least the memory of her Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess whose music shimmered like glass spun from sunlight. You can almost see her at her writing desk, quill hovering in midair, head tilted as though listening to a voice no one else can hear. She called them visions, but to anyone standing nearby, they must have looked like daydreams that caught fire. Her compositions didn't obey the rules of her time. They stretched upward, vaulting higher and higher, as though she were trying to climb back to wherever the voice came from. The mainstream historians call her one of the first female composers of the Western canon. True, but that's like saying lightning is a bit bright. Her songs were ecstatic ladders, each interval a rung toward the divine, the quirky tidbit you might like. She claimed she could see music as colors moving through the air, a synesthetic halo that scientists today would label neurological crossover. But for Hildegard, those hues weren't neurons misfiring. They were the fingerprints of angels. In one letter, she wrote that when she sang, "My soul burns like a bell in the sunlight." It's not hard to imagine why people whispered about her, especially men of the cloth who couldn't quite reconcile holiness with such audacity. She performed in luminous white gowns instead of monastic black, and when her nuns sang, she arranged them in circles instead of rows, letting their voices blend like the spokes of a cosmic wheel. The effect, according to later witnesses, was otherworldly, too beautiful, some said, to be entirely safe. You picture the candlelit chapel filling with these voices, no instruments, no organ drone, just pure female breath expanding into the rafters until the architecture itself seems to sigh. Modern acoustical studies of the ruins of her abbey in Rupertsberg show the building resonates around 260 Hz, roughly middle C, right where the human voice feels most intimate. Coincidence, maybe, or maybe Hildegard understood that the body itself is an instrument tuned to the same key as the soul. Her writings on medicine, herbs, and cosmology all orbit this idea of cosmic symphony, the belief that every living thing emits a note, and that illness occurs when a body falls out of tune with creation. Fringe researchers love this part. They quote her as evidence of medieval proto-quantum thinking, which is a stretch but an entertaining one. Still, it's tempting to believe she sensed something we've forgotten, that vibration is the foundation of everything, and music is just us eavesdropping on existence. One of her surviving chants, O vis eternitatis, drifts through the centuries like incense. When reconstructed and sung in its original pitch, the overtones create a shimmering acoustic halo, the kind of resonance that makes your spine hum. You close your eyes and listen in your imagination, a slow, ascending melody that feels like light spilling through stained glass, each note stretching time a little thinner. Hildegard called these pieces symphonia, not symphonies in the modern sense, but harmonies of heavenly forces. The open scholarly debate, still ongoing, is whether she composed purely from religious ecstasy or through deliberate experimentation. Did she transcribe divine dictation or invent it? The line between mystic and genius was blurry back then, and maybe that's why her music feels so alive even now. It vibrates at that perfect midpoint between revelation and rebellion. You sit on a weathered bench as the garden wind brushes your ears, and for a moment you swear you can hear a faint humming under the rustle of leaves. Maybe it's the bees, or maybe it's the world itself still resonating to her pitch. And you realize that if the devil's interval represented chaos, Hildegard's music was its opposite, the sound of the universe remembering how to breathe in tune. The road winds away from Hildegard's radiant abbey and drops into the gray hush of a northern valley where mist hangs like unspun wool. Somewhere out there, a shepherd's pipe is playing, a single thread of melody weaving through the fog. You follow it, boots sinking into wet grass, the world shrinking until only that sound remains, thin and hypnotic. It's not quite joyful, not quite mournful, just persistent, like a thought you can't stop thinking. In the Middle Ages, Shepherds were both guardians and ghosts of the countryside, men who slept with the wind and spoke more to their flocks than to other people. Music was their company, and the simple reed pipes they carved from willow or elder carried across miles of empty field. One mainstream historical fact worth remembering: in some regions of medieval France and Wales, these herdsmen songs evolved into coded signals, different tunes for lost sheep, approaching storms, or prowling wolves. The melodies became a practical language of survival. Yet folklore added a darker harmony. Villagers whispered about the piper who calls the fog, a figure who could charm not just animals but souls adrift between worlds. He'd play at twilight, they said, when the sun bled out behind the hills, and the dead mistook his tune for a summons home. You pause at a wooden stile, peering into the haze where the pipe still wavers like breath on glass. The quirky tidbit historians rarely mention: archaeologists once unearthed a 13th century flute in Yorkshire, carved from a sheep's tibia, the holes worn smooth as if by decades of use, and local legend insists it belonged to a man who could play the spirits to rest. Scientific journals call it a pastoral artifact, but the villagers still call it the bone song, the fringe theory. Take this with salt and superstition claims bone instruments vibrate sympathetically with the material memory of the creature they came from, giving their notes an uncanny warmth that feels alive. You imagine the sound rising through fog like a voice half remembered. Somewhere behind you a crow croaks once, and you flinch, though you tell yourself it's only coincidence. But in the 14th century, when a fog rolled down without wind, and the sheep scattered in panic, chronicles recorded that villagers blamed invisible musicians, spirits rehearsing for Judgment Day. Scholars debate whether those accounts were symbolic, moral warnings about temptation, or literal weather reports dressed as miracles. Either way, the image stuck: music as the bridge between flesh and vapor. You climb a small hill and finally see him, the piper, or rather the idea of him, a lone figure wrapped in a rough cloak, his back to you, the pipe rising and falling against the gray. You can't hear when he stops, only that the silence afterward feels heavier than the tune itself, as if the valley is holding its breath. In that stillness you sense what medieval people must have felt every day. That sound is alive. That silence is not empty but waiting. Maybe that's why they filled their nights with song, to prove to themselves the dark wasn't listening back. You pull your cloak tighter, fog beating on your lashes, and turn toward the faint lights of the village below. The piper has vanished, but his melody lingers. 3 notes, unresolved, hanging in your chest like a question that doesn't need an answer. And as you walk, you realize you've begun to hum it too, softly, the same way countless travelers did before you, hoping it keeps the spirits or the silence at bay. By the time you reach the next monastery, night has folded over the valley like a heavy wool cloak, and the only light comes from a scatter of torches trembling against wet stone. You slip inside through a half-open door and are met by a low vibration that seems to exist not in the air but in your chest. The monks are chanting, not the bright, floating melodies of Hildegard, but the deep, endless drone of Gregorian plainsong, that sacred hum designed to erase the boundary between breath and eternity. The sound fills every crevice of the chapel, rolling like distant thunder that never breaks. You stand in the back, motionless, listening as the voices merge into one enormous column of air, perfectly still yet constantly shifting, like smoke made of sound. Historians tell us this chant emerged in the 8th century under Pope Gregory I, though, fun fact, he probably never wrote a single note of it. The term Gregorian was a clever branding exercise centuries later, the Church's way of giving anonymous devotion a name and a halo. The quirky truth is that these melodies were often borrowed from older folk hymns and repurposed, baptized by repetition until no one remembered their pagan birthplaces. What makes them unique is the drone, that steady line beneath the melody that never moves, Acousticians studying old stone monasteries found that long corridors and barrel vaults amplify certain low frequencies so powerfully that they create what physicists call standing waves, pockets of vibration that stay in place even when the singers pause. That's why, if you whisper in some crypts, your voice seems to hang in midair for several seconds afterward. You can imagine how the monks interpreted this proof that their prayers had substance, that holiness was physically echoing back. One chronicle from Cluny Abbey in the 1100 describes a hum beneath the hymn like the breathing of God. Modern scholars suggest it was merely the resonance of the cloister's cisterns beneath the floor. But the monks heard a presence, and that was enough. As the chant continues, the overtones start to shimmer. You can't tell whether they're voices or tricks of architecture. Each new phrase stacks like translucent glass until the air feels thick. If you've ever stood next to a large organ when it hits a deep note, you know that vibration, the one that rearranges your heartbeat for a second. That's what fills this chapel now. There's even a documented case from 1257 in a Benedictine house near Florence. Several novices collapsed during the midnight office, claiming the chant rose from their bones. Doctors blamed fasting and candle smoke. The abbot called it divine intoxication. The open scholarly debate circles this moment still. Was Gregorian chant designed to induce trance? Some argue its mathematical intervals mirror the natural rhythm of human respiration, creating a feedback loop between breath and tone. Others insist that's a modern projection, that medieval monks sought only purity, not hypnosis. But if you stand here long enough, eyes half closed, body vibrating like a tuning fork, you begin to suspect both answers might be true. Somewhere between intention and effect lies mystery. And mystery was the church's favorite instrument. You catch a whiff of beeswax and stone dust as the melody swells into a slow alleluia. The Latin words are simple, but the sound behind them is immense, as if the universe itself were exhaling through 1,000 throats. There's a fringe claim that certain resonant frequencies around 110 Hz. Yes, the same pitch found in many Romanesque chapels can trigger mild euphoria and visions. Scientists roll their eyes, but you can't ignore how your skin prickles, how your balance tilts just a little with each pulse. The chant finally settles on a single note that fades so gradually you almost miss the moment it disappears. In that instant, the silence is deafening. Every candle seems to bow, as if the flames are listening. A mouse skitters along the wall, breaking the spell, and one monk coughs, a small sound that feels blasphemous after so much stillness. You let out a breath you didn't realize you were holding. The echoes take their time dying. They slide down the arches and vanish somewhere near the crypt. You remember the stories from the first abbey, the choir beneath, and wonder if that hum below your feet might still be answering. Perhaps it's only the river running under the stones, or perhaps it's the residue of centuries of song, voices packed so tightly into the walls they've become part of the structure. Either way, when you step back outside, the night seems louder than before. The wind carries a faint vibration, a ghostly aftertaste of harmony, and for a heartbeat you could swear the world itself is droning along. You smile at the absurdity of it and pull your cloak close, but the sound follows you down the path, steady and patient, like a prayer that refuses to end. The road curls away from the monastery and spills into a patch of wild heath, the kind of place where sound travels differently, thinner, sharper, as if the wind has been tuned. You spot a small campfire by a ruined chapel wall, its smoke curling into a starless sky, and beside it sits a man hunched over something pale in his hands. When you come closer, you realize it's a flute. No, not wood, but bone. Carved clean and hollow, the polished surface catching firelight like ivory. He raises it to his lips, and the note that escapes is faint but pure, a ribbon of air that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. Medieval musicians knew instruments like this long before cathedrals had organs or lutes. They called them flabuta, pipes made from the bones of animals, or, when legends needed to be dramatic, from humans. The mainstream record shows that bone flutes date back to prehistory, but their use persisted well into the Middle Ages, especially among shepherds and wandering minstrels who couldn't afford metal or fine wood. Yet in folklore, these same flutes carried an aura of danger. A song played on bone, it was said, called back the spirit of its original owner. The quirky tidbit, a 14th-century English ballad called The Singing Leg, tells of a traveler who fashioned a whistle from a dead man's shin bone and was haunted each night by the tune he'd played. Most scholars call it moral propaganda, a medieval PSA about grave robbing, but some ethnomusicologists think it hints at genuine ritual practice. Archaeologists in Poland found several flutes buried in grave goods, wrapped carefully in cloth, as though meant to accompany the deceased. And here's where science nods to myth. Bones naturally resonate at frequencies close to the human voice, especially femurs and radii. When air passes through, it creates overtones that mimic speech formants, the same acoustic trick that makes us hear ghosts in static. No wonder villagers believed these instruments could talk back. You imagine a funeral procession winding through the hills, mourners humming softly while a single flute leads the way, its hollow tones sliding between prayer and lament. The open scholarly debate is whether such instruments were ever used in liturgical contexts or only in folk ceremonies. The Church frowned on them, branding them relics of heathen superstition, yet a 1298 inventory from a Cistercian abbey in Burgundy lists pipes of horn and bone for nocturnal devotion. No one can explain that entry. Perhaps they were used for signaling in darkness, perhaps for something stranger. You crouch by the fire as the man plays on, eyes closed, breath steady. The melody seems to move the air itself. The smoke coils differently, the grass trembles though no wind passes. You feel it inside your ribs, a vibration older than words, like the echo of your own breathing given shape. The performer finally stops and smiles without looking at you, saying nothing. He places the flute on a flat stone, and for a moment you think you hear a faint sigh, as if the bone has remembered being alive. When you blink, the man is gone, the fire dwindling to embers. You're alone with the sound still circling in your ears, wondering whether the tune summoned him or you. Medieval chroniclers would have called this a visitation, proof that music and spirit share the same breath. You call it a good story, but even as you walk away, the wind through the grass starts to whistle in that same haunting pitch, and you can't quite tell if it's the world imitating you or the other way around. By the time dawn starts bruising the sky, you've found shelter in a crumbling manor once owned by a minor lord, whose only legacy, according to rumor, was a psaltery that played itself. The room smells of cold iron and mildew, and in the middle of it rests a small, triangular instrument strung with what looks disturbingly like hair. The psaltery was the ancestor of the modern zither, a modest harp meant to accompany sacred songs, but this one is anything but modest. Its frame is scorched at the edges, its strings tuned not to any church scale you recognize. When you pluck one, the note rings longer than it should, trembling against the stone like a voice trapped inside. You find mention of similar instruments in a dusty 13th century inventory from Lubeck, Una Psalteria Diabolica, Sonan Sini Tactu, a devilish psaltery which sounds without touch. Historians think it's a scribal joke. The local peasants didn't. They said the Lord's musician had tuned it using forbidden intervals, perhaps even the tritone you heard about earlier, and that on nights when thunder rolled across the river, the psaltery answered with harmonies that no human hand had played. You strum again, just once. The sound is strange, beautiful, but wrong, hovering between major and minor, neither resolving nor fading. That's the mark of an ancient tuning system known as Pythagorean temperament, once beloved by scholars who believed pure mathematical ratios revealed divine order. The Church later replaced it with more practical tuning, but before that transition, music like this could feel eerie, half divine, half deranged. There's a quirky anecdote from a chronicle in Ghent. One monk claimed his psaltery sang a second melody beneath the first, as if another player mimicked him from under the floor. Scientists blame sympathetic resonance, the way strings vibrate together, but you can't shake the image of a duet between the living and the dead. Modern musicians reconstructing medieval instruments have noticed the same effect in vaulted spaces. Certain frequencies create ghost notes that seem to float independently. The open scholarly debate circles whether medieval composers were aware of these acoustic tricks or merely stumbled upon them. Some say they embraced them deliberately, calling them miracula sonorum, miracles of sound. Others argue these miracles were evidence of corruption, proof that music itself could deceive the senses. You stare at the psaltery, the last notes fading into the drafty silence, and think about the fragile line between harmony and haunting. Perhaps that's why this instrument was locked away. It wasn't evil, only honest. It revealed that the sacred and the spectral might share the same frequency. You close its lid carefully and back away, heart still humming with the vibration. Outside, the wind drags through the trees in long, slow chords, as if the whole forest has been listening. You leave the manor before sunrise, your footsteps echoing down a road glazed with frost, and in the distance you hear a bell. One clear tone, then another, then silence. It takes a moment to realize no one is awake to ring it. Villagers in the Middle Ages told stories of bells that tolled without hands, often on the eve of plague, flood, or death. Chroniclers recorded these incidents with the same steady disbelief you hear in modern weather reports. One such record from 1361 in Bruges describes how the cathedral bells began to swing of their own accord, ringing a dirge so slow that men wept and women fainted. The clergy declared it a divine warning. Local farmers decided the bell tower was haunted by a monk who drowned in the canal. Today, historians say strong winds can set massive bronze bells in motion if the clappers hang loose, but the math never quite adds up. The weight and resistance are immense. Even now, engineers admit they'd need a storm of impossible strength to explain some medieval accounts. The quirky tidbit: there's an entry in a Parisian ledger about a bell called Marie Noire, forged from a mix of metal and melted coins, said to speak when touched by moonlight. The story goes that its maker vanished the night it first sounded, leaving only a burned rope and a faint smell of ozone. That's probably folklore, but an intriguing one because similar legends appear across Europe, from England to Bohemia, always involving bells forged from sacred and profane materials blended together. The idea was that such alloys blurred the line between the blessed and the cursed, giving the bell a kind of moral voice. Some abbeys banned mixed metal casting altogether, fearing it produced instruments that summoned not the faithful but the forgotten. Modern acoustics shows that imperfect casting can create complex overtones, beating patterns that sound almost vocal. It's easy to imagine villagers hearing these phantom harmonies and thinking the bells were answering themselves. The open scholarly debate still drifts between psychology and physics. Were medieval witnesses primed by fear and faith to imagine living sound, or did the resonance of those vast towers genuinely trick the senses? There's even a modern experiment where researchers recorded ancient bells and slowed the frequencies. The resulting audio sounds disturbingly like breathing. You stand beneath a ruined belfry, now frost crackling underfoot, and look up at the mute bronze giant hanging from its frame. The air is still, yet when the first light of morning hits the bell's lip, you swear you feel a tremor, not a sound but a pressure, the ghost of vibration rolling down through the iron. Maybe it's just the metal cooling, maybe not. For a second, you imagine all the bells of medieval Europe alive at once, breathing in the same rhythm, marking time not just for the living but for every echo left behind. Then the wind shifts, and the silence resumes, heavier than before. By midday, you reach the edge of a forest where the trees lean close, their trunks stained dark with centuries of moss. The locals call it St. Valerie's Wood, though no one remembers a saint by that name. What they do remember is the choir that disappeared here. The story begins in 1423, when a small monastery sat at the forest's heart, a modest stone building that doubled as a hospice for plague survivors. The brothers were known for their voices, pale men who sang so purely that travelers claimed the sound floated miles beyond the trees. According to one parchment fragment in the Rouen archives, the abbot commissioned a new hymn for Easter, a complex polyphony that layered voices in ways no one had tried before. It was meant to imitate the choirs of heaven. On the morning of the first performance, peasants gathered in the clearing to listen. The monks began to sing, but midway through the final verse the music stopped. No fading, no stumble, just a sudden silence. When villagers rushed inside, the choir stalls were empty. Robes lay folded, candles burned steady, and the air shimmered with a high, faint tone that refused to die. It lingered for days, so the record says, like a sunbeam made of sound. The abbey was abandoned soon after, left to sink beneath ivy and rumor. The mainstream explanation points to disease or bandits, but there's no sign of struggle in the archaeology. No bones, no graves, no fire marks. What survives are the notations of that lost hymn, copied by later musicians who swear its harmonies are impossible to reproduce without one part vanishing into dissonance. Modern analysts discovered that one melodic line sits just beyond the range of human hearing, ultrasound frequencies caused by the spacing of notes. In laboratories, when choirs attempt the piece, recording equipment picks up a ghostly overtone, a fifth voice that isn't sung by anyone. Engineers shrug it off as interference. Mystics call it the echo of St. Valerie's singers. The quirky tidbit, tucked in a 17th century travel diary, claims that shepherds near the ruins sometimes heard the hymn at dawn. Faint but precise, drifting between trees as if carried by those who need no breath. No one's proven it, but even rational scholars admit forests make excellent amplifiers. The trunks and canopies bounce sound waves in loops, letting notes travel far beyond their source. The open scholarly debate centers on whether this legend reflects an early understanding of resonance or a medieval allegory for spiritual rapture, the idea that perfect harmony could dissolve the body. Some theologians of the era warned that singing too beautifully risked assumptio per cantum, being lifted away by one's own voice. You smile at the thought. What a way to go. Sung out of existence. The forest grows quieter as evening sets in. And, though you tell yourself it's just birds settling, the hush feels deliberate. A breeze moves through the leaves with rhythmic precision, like a choir inhaling. You could almost believe the missing monks still rehearse somewhere beyond the range of hearing, their eternal note stitched into the fabric of the air. When you finally turn to leave, a single tone follows you, soft, steady, almost kind. It fades only when the trees thin and the first village light glows ahead, proof that the living world still remembers the pitch of those who sang themselves away. The village you reach that night clings to a hillside crowned with a small stone church and a graveyard that glitters faintly with frost. The innkeeper swears the king's men once camped here, though no one agrees which king. There were too many in those centuries, all of them crowned, uncrowned, and buried with the same ceremony. Inside the church hangs a tapestry depicting a royal funeral procession, gold thread dulled by candle smoke. The figures carry torches, banners, and an instrument shaped like an elongated lyre, the viola regalis. It was said to be played only for monarchs in death, each string representing a generation of their lineage. When one ruler died, the lowest string was cut and burned, its ash scattered into the tomb. A chronicler from 1317 describes how, during the burial of King Philippe V, musicians performed a composition titled Cantus Regum Dormientium, the Song of Sleeping Kings. The melody supposedly descended step by step, each phrase lower than the last, until it ended in silence so heavy that the mourners fell to their knees. The church approved this ritual, calling it a lullaby for the righteous, but there were whispers that if you reversed the sequence, playing the notes upward, the dead could stir. That superstition was old even then. Romans once inscribed tombs with silent songs meant to awaken spirits for oracles. The mainstream fact. Several medieval requiem masses used dies irae sequences that descend chromatically, symbolizing the soul's descent into rest. The fringe claim, much more colorful, is that certain royal chapels kept inverted versions of those chants, played only in secret during anniversaries of succession, to consult the counsel of the departed. One parchment from Avignon's papal library even notes a melodia ad inversionum, though no notation survives. You stand near the altar where a cracked stone slab bears the name of a forgotten duke. The caretaker tells you that on storm nights, the slab hums faintly, a sound like a bow drawn across glass. Scientists would call it microseismic vibration, wind pushing through the vaults, but the villagers call it the king remembering his crown. You kneel, touch the stone, and feel a tremor, almost like a pulse traveling through centuries of decay. The quirky tidbit here, bronze funeral horns unearthed in Denmark have been found tuned to harmonic intervals matching Gregorian chant. The theory is that when two were played together in a closed crypt, the interference created a beating tone that feels alive, as if the tomb itself were breathing. It's easy to imagine courtiers mistaking that vibration for the monarch's voice. Modern musicians who've reconstructed those horns describe the resonance as a whisper made of thunder. The open, scholarly debate now asks whether these rituals were symbolic theater or early experiments in acoustic resurrection, the use of sound to preserve memory and vibration. Every culture, it seems, wanted the dead to hear one last song. As you listen to the wind moaning through the church beams, you realize the melody hasn't vanished at all. It's simply changed keys. Each gust against the eaves carries the same descending sigh the monks once sang, a requiem that never resolves. You step back outside, the night alive with that low royal hum, and you can't help thinking that maybe kings never truly rest. They just keep conducting the wind. The road bends toward the sea, and at the edge of a crumbling port town you find what's left of a monastery scriptorium. Collapsed roof, half-buried shelves, and one surviving desk with a book fused to it by centuries of damp. Its pages are black. Not charred, not ink spilled, black as obsidian. The lines of music written in reverse silver script that gleams when the light hits just right. This, the villagers whisper, is the Codex Tenebrarum, the Book of Darkness, a manuscript so peculiar that even the church archivists refuse to catalog it. The mainstream historical fact. In the late 14th century, a new musical notation called Black Mensural appeared across Europe, written in filled-in note shapes instead of hollow ones. Scholars use that term technically, but the monks here took it literally, believing black notes represented songs of mourning best kept silent. This copy exaggerates the practice, every stave drenched in ink until only faint glints of silver remain. You run your fingertip over one line. It feels raised, almost carved. The legend says a scribe of this monastery attempted to transcribe an anthem heard in a dream, dictated by a voice that insisted the notes be turned inside out. He worked for 7 nights without sleep, and on the 8th the brothers found him slumped over the parchment, smiling faintly, the quill still in his hand. The quirky tidbit scholars love. Ultraviolet scans of certain surviving fragments reveal that beneath the visible black layer lies an earlier score, normal sacred plain chant, erased and overwritten backwards. That alone fuels the fringe theories. Some musicologists argue it's merely a palimpsest born of poverty. Parchment reused, ink thickened to hide earlier mistakes. Others whisper it's a deliberate inversion ritual, a mirror hymn meant to undo sound itself. The debate remains open, and perhaps will forever, because every attempt to perform the melody ends in failure. Singers report dizziness, nausea, or sudden silence. Microphones cut out. Air pressure shifts, candles gutter. Rational explanations abound. The dense notation forces singers into impossible intervals. The black pigment absorbs heat, and destabilizes the parchment. The room's acoustics exaggerate harmonics until feedback kills the tone. Yet it's easy to imagine medieval minds interpreting that collapse as punishment, or proof. You hold the book closer to the window, and the silver notes shimmer like constellations against a night sky. For a fleeting second, you feel tempted to hum the first line, just to know what kind of song could outlast ink and fear. But the air here carries a memory. Even the gulls outside stay quiet. Instead, you imagine the scene centuries ago, lamplight trembling, the scribe bending over his work, tracing forbidden intervals in reverse. Maybe he wasn't conjuring darkness but trying to trap it, the way saints trapped demons in bottles. When you close the cover, a faint puff of dust escapes, and for a heartbeat it sounds like a sigh, low and resonant, perfectly pitched. You tell yourself it's only the sea breeze sneaking through the cracks, but the tone lingers, steady as a heartbeat, until you step outside and the daylight swallows it whole. You follow the coast until cliffs give way to a valley of half-ruined abbeys, their arches rising like fossilized ribs against the sky. One of them, St. Gerose, was famous not for relics or miracles but for its sound. Builders in the 12th century claimed they could shape air as stone, carving proportions so exact that a whisper could circle the entire cloister before fading. You walk through its remains now, your boots scraping dust, and when you murmur a single word it multiplies your own voice, sliding along the walls in overlapping ripples. It feels like being surrounded by invisible monks repeating after you. Historians know that medieval architects were more than masons. They were practical acousticians, guided by the idea that space itself was an instrument. The mainstream historical fact: Romanesque chapels often used specific ratios between height, width, and length, especially 1, 2, or 2, 3, to maximize resonance and sustain chant. It wasn't mysticism, it was geometry serving theology. Sound made visible. Still, chroniclers spoke of those echoes as proof that angels sang back. A 1264 report from this very abbey claims a visiting bishop halted mid-sermon when his words returned to him from every direction like an unseen choir. The monks, of course, took it as divine applause. You trace a finger over the worn capitals of a column. Each groove seems to breathe faintly, storing centuries of vibration. The quirky tidbit comes from a restoration diary written in 1890. Workers discovered that the wall's inner mortar was mixed with crushed seashells. Acoustic engineers later tested samples and found that the calcium crystals diffuse sound waves, creating a softer, more lingering decay. In other words, the builders literally laced the sea into their sanctuary. The fringe interpretation is more romantic, that the shells were relics of pilgrimage from Compostela, meant to ensure every prayer reached heaven through maritime memory. Either way, the effect is unmistakable. You hum just a note, and the air seems to fold around you, holding it tenderly before letting go. Scholars still argue whether such precision was intentional artistry or happy accident, but one debate endures. Did medieval acoustics shape theology, or did theology demand the acoustics? Did believers start to imagine God as an echo because they heard him reflected in stone? You pace the cloister walk, listening to your own footsteps answer themselves a half-second late. In some corner cell long ago, a monk might have tested harmonies here, realizing that even silence could sing if you gave it the right container. The idea ripples through history. Cathedrals as amplifiers of faith, each arch a tuning fork. Even today, when sound engineers measure these ruins, they find frequencies that match the human heart rate. 60 to 70 beats per minute. Coincidence? Maybe. But standing here you sense why worship once felt physiological, why chanting was as much breathing as believing. The sun dips, and your last echo fades into the vault, stretched thin until it becomes memory. For a moment you understand what those long-dead builders chased. Not glory, not perfection, but a room that could hold eternity for just a second longer. Night finds you in a roadside tavern, the sort of place where smoke collects under the beams and travelers share stories loud enough to forget how dark it is outside. A minstrel sits by the hearth, his cloak patched with every color of dust, his instrument a small bowed fiddle, polished smooth by centuries of hands, rests on his knee. When he begins to play, the room stills. The melody is simple, but there's something in it that tugs at the chest, a pattern that makes laughter pause halfway through a breath. According to legend, this tune doesn't belong to him. It's a relic passed from master to apprentice, a melody no one writes down for fear it will fade the moment ink touches paper. The mainstream historical fact: traveling minstrels in the 13th and 14th centuries often carried repertoires of oral songs that served as living archives. Some were love ballads, some battle chronicles, but a few, especially in Brittany and Occitania, were said to carry healing. Physicians scoffed, but monks noted that patients who heard certain modes recovered faster. A primitive glimpse of music therapy. This melody, however, feels heavier than healing. The tavern keeper swears those who hear it alone in the dark begin to dream of faces they've never met. A strange superstition, but it lingers like the last chord of a violin in an empty church. The quirky tidbit comes from a 15th century marginal note in a songbook discovered at Mont Saint-Michel: Canticum quod lacrimas movet, servare vetitum est. The song that moves tears must not be kept. Scholars translate it as metaphor, but every attempt to notate such wandering airs always ends with pages torn out or blank staves. The fringe explanation is psychological. Certain rhythmic patterns mimic the human heartbeat at rest, while alternating tempos mirror the breath of someone grieving. It's the sound of empathy encoded in melody, a reminder that sadness recognizes itself. Yet the open scholarly debate remains whether these emotional responses were intentional composition or coincidence, a side effect of the modal scales that dominated medieval Europe. You watch the minstrel's bow glide, his eyes half closed as if he's listening to something beyond the room. When the tune ends, the silence feels physical, thick as wool. A few patrons wipe their faces without knowing why. The minstrel smiles faintly, accepting no coin, only the quiet. Then he turns the fiddle upside down, pressing his ear to its hollow body, as though waiting for the instrument to answer. You think of all the voices trapped in wood grain, of centuries vibrating inside a single shell. Maybe that's the real secret. The tune isn't his to play, but his to release. Outside, the wind catches through the thatch in the same rhythm, echoing the refrain. As you step into the night, you realize the melody hasn't left you. It threads through your mind, a low murmur at the edge of thought, as if the song has decided it prefers to live inside your ribs. Morning fog settles over a market square where the cobblestones gleam with yesterday's rain, and a faint melody drifts between the stalls, slow, mournful, almost like a prayer hummed through clenched teeth. You recognize it from fragments copied in countless manuscripts or a pro nobis peccatoribus, the plea of the living during the pestilence. During the Black Death of the 14th century, music became both shield and surrender. Processions wound through cities with banners raised high, choirs singing penitential chants that echoed off shuttered houses. The mainstream historical fact: Pope Clement VI issued formal indulgences for those who joined these parades of mercy, believing collective song might calm divine wrath. In Avignon alone, thousands marched barefoot behind crucifixes, their voices weaving through clouds of incense and smoke. Yet the chronicles tell of a strange side effect. Villagers swore the songs lingered after the singers had passed, disembodied harmonies floating through empty streets at dusk. Physicians called it imagination. Priests called it proof that angels wept with humanity. The quirky tidbit comes from a physician's journal in Siena, who noted that cats yowled and dogs howled in perfect rhythm to the chants, as though creation itself had learned the refrain. That line always makes scholars smile, but you can almost hear it now, the whole world joining in a requiem. The fringe story: half rumor and half legend, claims that some towns forbade singing altogether, convinced the melodies themselves carried contagion. After all, they spread invisibly through air. People grew sick after hearing them. One Dominican friar even wrote that certain scales vibrate the black wind that killed without touch. Modern acousticians have tested ancient scores and found droning intervals around 80 Hz low enough to cause unease, even nausea, in enclosed spaces thick with incense. Imagine hundreds of voices chanting in that register while the smell of death clung to everything. It must have felt like standing inside the lungs of the world. The open scholarly debate endures. Were these chants acts of comfort or of panic? Did they soothe or summon? Some argue that the communal rhythm slowed breathing, easing terror. Others insist the relentless repetition bordered on trance, opening minds to collective hysteria. Whatever the truth, the sound became inseparable from memory. Even after the plague subsided, composers kept weaving fragments of those laments into later masses, a quiet memorial hidden in sacred harmony. You wander past the market's edge toward a small chapel blackened by centuries of smoke. Inside, carvings of skulls grin from the choir stalls, their empty eyes fixed on the altar. You hum a single note, and the room answers instantly, resonance crawling across the walls like dust stirred by breath. For a moment you hear other voices layered faintly beneath yours, patient and resigned. Maybe it's only echo, maybe not. Outside, the bells begin to toll for midday, that familiar rhythm returning from a world that never quite learned silence. And as you walk away, you can't tell whether the wind is carrying your song forward or bringing theirs back. You reach a crumbling university town where the streets still smell faintly of candle wax and parchment dust, a place that once nurtured theologians by day and alchemists by night. The same vaulted lecture halls that echoed with Latin disputations once trembled with the hum of experiment, glass spheres, tuning forks, and the slow drip of liquids whose colors changed with each note sung nearby. Here, in the mid-1300s, music and alchemy briefly courted one another, each claiming dominion over hidden transformation. The mainstream historical fact, scholars like Roger Bacon and later Robert Flood wrote treatises linking harmonic ratios to the music of the spheres, proposing that matter itself vibrated in sympathy with celestial intervals. To them, sound was not art but architecture, the blueprint of creation. In these halls, monks debated whether the right tone could purify metal the way prayer purifies sin. They never found gold, of course, but they did discover something subtler. The realization that resonance could make a flame dance, that sand on a drum skin would leap into geometric patterns, that sound had shape. You imagine a friar bent over his alembic, humming gently while vapors curl upward, his melody turning the laboratory into a chapel. The quirky tidbit whispered in university gossip concerned a scholar named Petrus de Umbria, who claimed he'd produced a tincture of harmony, a potion that sang when poured. His notes, literal and musical, are lost, but one letter survives describing how a simple chant made mercury ripple as if it possessed a soul. Modern physicists would call that vibration, but to Petrus it was proof that sound was life. The fringe speculation still alive in some corners of academia proposes that medieval alchemists stumbled upon early acoustic levitation using standing waves to move small particles of metal or droplets of liquid, phenomena later rediscovered with precise instruments. They lacked our vocabulary, so they described miracles. The open scholarly debate asks whether these men were scientists before science or mystics chasing metaphor. You run your fingers along a cracked wall and feel a faint hum from the street outside the market bell, ringing somewhere far away, yet the stones carry it like a heartbeat. Perhaps that's what they meant by alchemy, not turning lead to gold, but translating vibration into wonder. In an unused cloister, you find a stone basin once used for washing pigments. When you tap its rim, the water quivers into concentric rings that shimmer like quicksilver. The echo lingers far longer than it should, stretching thin until it becomes a tone beyond hearing. For a fleeting instant you think you understand what those old experimenters sought, the bridge between spirit and substance, the proof that every solid thing still remembers it once was sound. You leave the courtyard smiling, the air faintly metallic on your tongue, as though the world itself has been transmuted, if not into gold, then into music. Rain follows you east, drumming on the hood of your cloak as you cross into the Hanseatic city of Lübeck, where merchants once sold relics, salt, and occasionally curiosity. In the dusty archives of St. Mary's, a clerk shows you one of those curiosities, a wooden recorder sealed in a glass case, carved from ash and stained almost black. A note beside it reads, Instrumentum Maleficum, 1563. The legend says it belonged to a boy who could summon storms with a single breath. The mainstream historical fact, Lübeck's church records confirm that in the 1500s, the cathedral possessed an unusually long tenor recorder used during Lent, its range deep enough to mimic the drone of a human choir. That's probably all this is, a leftover of liturgical music, but history loves drama more than paperwork. According to local tales, animals reacted violently whenever it played. Horses reared, dogs barked, birds flew in spirals. One witness claimed fish thrashed in their barrels at the market as if the air itself had turned electric. The quirky tidbit: when modern restorers tested its acoustics decades ago, they found it produced subharmonics below 20 Hz, infrasound too low for human ears but powerful enough to vibrate organs and stir unease. Scientists now use that frequency to study how sound induces fear. Yet imagine encountering it in a candlelit church, unaware of the physics. Listeners would feel the floor move, the ribs tighten, the sense of invisible presence pressing close. No wonder Lübeck's parishioners called it Teufel's Flöte, the devil's flute. A pamphlet from 1564 even warns that its tone rends the peace of the spirit and invites what should not be named. The fringe theorists insist it was tuned deliberately to manipulate emotion, an early experiment in sonic control centuries before psychoacoustics existed. The open scholarly debate asks whether these stories exaggerate superstition or describe genuine awareness of sound's physical power. In truth, the recorder's maker, one Matthias Kirchner, was also a shipwright. He built organs and hulls alike, both designed to withstand pressure. Perhaps he understood resonance better than priests did. You stand before the case as the wind howls outside, the museum's fluorescent light turning the instrument's surface into a dull gleam. Somewhere, a floorboard creaks in perfect rhythm with the gusts. You imagine the boy again, blowing a single note that shivers the rafters and sets the seat a-trembling. The curator laughs off the curse, saying the recorder hasn't been played in centuries. Yet when you lean close, your breath fogs the glass, and just for a heartbeat you think you hear a faint sigh from within, a whisper of air caught between life and legend, reminding you that even silence carries a key. You travel south into Würzburg, where the cobblestones still echo with old hysteria. In the 1620s, this city burned with more than faith. It burned with fear. The archives hold a slim, brittle folio labeled Canticum Maleficarum, the songbook of witches. Its cover is water-stained, its notes inked in frantic, uneven strokes. The inquisitors claimed these were melodies used in witchcraft tunes to raise tempests or whisper with spirits. The mainstream historical fact: during the great witch trials of Central Europe, musical evidence appeared in dozens of testimonies. Women accused of singing storms or chanting the harvest to rot were tried and executed based on verses they never wrote. In truth, much of that so-called sorcery came from folk songs, lullabies, and harvest chants that predated Christianity by centuries. Yet fear has perfect pitch. Once it finds resonance, it amplifies. The court records describe the interrogators demanding that the accused sing these melodies aloud. One woman, Anna Rees, sang so softly the scribe wrote, "Vox quasi infantis mortui," a voice like a dead child's. She was condemned anyway. A quirky tidbit is that fragments of her song survived, scrawled in a margin by a sympathetic clerk. Modern ethnomusicologists reconstructed it and discovered a simple pentatonic pattern, similar to lullabies still hummed in the region today. What the judges called invocation was likely nostalgia, the memory of cradle songs passed from mother to daughter. The fringe historians, of course, go further. They note that these minor scales emphasize frequencies between 400 and 500 Hz, close to the resonant hum of the human skull. Some suggest the women used that resonance deliberately, creating trance through repetition. Whether that's science or imagination, the result was the same. The line between superstition and survival blurred into melody. The open scholarly debate asks how much of early modern witchcraft was really a persecution of women's oral culture. The songs, herbs, and healing knowledge they preserved while men wrote theology. You sit in the courthouse-turned-museum, the walls thick with the smell of dust and candle soot. When you hum one of those notes under your breath, the sound bounces strangely, as though the stones remember her. Outside, thunder rolls across the valley. Just weather, of course, but for a heartbeat the timing feels rehearsed. You can almost hear the rhythm of the old accusations. One question, one denial, one strike of thunder. And in that rhythm lingers the echo of every song that tried to soothe a crying child, only to be called a spell. You close the folio gently, and its brittle pages sigh a sound softer than guilt, heavier than history. You arrive in Prague beneath a sky bruised purple with stormlight, the Charles Bridge slick with rain, statues of saints glaring through the mist. Every stone here has an echo, but some echoes belong to nights no one remembers. The locals whisper about the Nochny Maso, the night mass, once held beneath the old monastery of St. Agnes, where music was forbidden after midnight. The mainstream historical fact: in the 15th century, Prague's Hussite wars turned faith into warfare, and secret congregations met underground to preserve old chants the reformers deemed idolatrous. One chronicler, a monk named Jan Odolan, left a note about a choir whose harmony summoned not the faithful but the feverish. That might sound like metaphor until you descend the monastery's crypt and feel the air move in slow circular breaths. Legend claims the congregation sang a version of the Dies Irae reversed melody descending into chaos, rhythm collapsing until no human ear could find its center. The quirky tidbit comes from a 19th century excavation report. Workers found fragments of parchment with musical staves spiraling inward like a labyrinth, as if the score were meant to be followed forever without escape. Scholars think it was a symbolic meditation on mortality, yet those who've attempted to reconstruct it report vertigo, nausea, even hallucinations after a few repetitions. Modern researchers note that the circular notation forces singers into overlapping tempos, generating acoustic beating tones that can mimic whispers or distant screams. The fringe story claims that when the night mass reached its climax, the candles in the crypt flickered blue, and the congregation vanished, leaving only their breath crystallized on the walls. The open scholarly debate still wonders whether these tales grew from religious repression or psychological contagion, how easily faith turns to frenzy when harmony frays. You stand now in the same crypt, the ceiling dripping with damp, your lantern haloing the broken frescoes. When you hum a note, it multiplies instantly. The air answers you. The resonance builds until it feels like the room itself is singing. Perhaps that's all the night mass ever was, a conversation between stone and breath, mistaken for sorcery. Still, as the last vibration fades, you could swear something hums back from the dark stairwell, a tone older than language, steady as a heartbeat under the city. You leave quickly, the sound following you up through the cobblestones, until it dissolves into the thunder above. The thunder fades behind you as dawn spills over the Vltava. And by the time you reach Vienna, the city hums with the quiet vanity of scholars, men and women who spend their lives trying to reconstruct the sound of the past. In the archives of the Musikverein, an attendant in gloves leads you to a locked drawer labeled Codex Speculorum, the Codex of Mirrors. The manuscript is thinner than you expect, only a dozen pages bound in cracked leather. Its Latin script intertwined with miniature drawings of polished discs and lines of music that twist in pairs. According to its faded colophon, it was written in 1487 by Brother Nicholas of Melk, a monk obsessed with reflections of the unseen voice, the mainstream historical fact. Late medieval theorists often experimented with mirror notation, music written forward on one stave and backward on another, designed to be read from both sides at once. Symbolically, it represented divine symmetry. Practically, it was impossible to perform. Nicholas pushed the idea further, inscribing each page with mirrored diagrams, small circles resembling early optical studies. When you tilt the parchment, the silver pigment still glints faintly, like trapped light. The legend says he built a chamber lined with polished brass and played inside it, hoping that the echoes would overlap until he could hear eternity listening. His abbey's records note that he died there, found kneeling, surrounded by shattered mirrors and a harp still vibrating with no visible touch. A quirky tidbit: during restoration in the 1970s, conservators noticed fingerprints burned into the margins of the codex, tiny ovals darkened by some unknown chemical reaction, as if heat had leapt from page to hand. No one can explain it. The ink contains trace mercury, perhaps from the metallic mirror paint. When sound historians scanned the notation, they discovered that, if played together, the mirrored lines cancel out at certain frequencies, creating interference that resembles digital silence centuries before electricity. The fringe believers, because of course there are always some, insist, Nicolaus unlocked the acoustic equivalent of invisibility, two tones meeting perfectly out of phase, annihilating each other, leaving behind only the faint tremor of what they call the angelic residue. The open scholarly debate frames it more politely as binaural nullification, a primitive experiment in phase cancellation, but you can't ignore the poetry music so symmetrical it erases itself, a hymn that ends not in sound but in its absence. You imagine the monk in his chamber, each note bouncing from brass to mirror, multiplying until the reflections of reflections no longer knew which was real. Perhaps he realized that listening is itself a form of reflection, that every echo is the world thinking about itself. When you touch the codex's final page, you notice a small inscription hidden under the hinge, Si odiste, odisteum. If you hear yourself, you hear God. You close the book carefully, the silver glimmering once more before darkness reclaims it. Outside, the street musicians are setting up in the square. Violins, hurdy-gurdies, the gentle clatter of coins on wood. One man tunes his lute, striking an interval that seems to vibrate longer than physics should allow. The mirrored tones of Nicolaus's impossible score echo faintly in your imagination, and for a heartbeat the two sounds past and present align, cancel and bloom into silence. The crowd doesn't notice, but you do. You feel the air thicken, like breath held by something vast and unseen. You walk away before the moment breaks, leaving the hum of the city behind. At the corner stands a glassmaker's shop, its window crowded with mirrors. For no good reason you pause and glance into one. The reflection is ordinary. The street, the sky, the moving crowd. But just for an instant the image seems to ripple as if the mirror were breathing with you. You lean closer and the faintest vibration rises in your ears, a single tone balanced perfectly between existence and absence. When you blink, the ripple is gone, the sound too, but you know you heard it. Two notes meeting, canceling, vanishing, and somehow that silence feels truer than any song you've ever known. You leave Vienna behind, following the road south until the hills widen into fields stitched with hedgerows and shrines, each one crowned with a wooden Christ, who seems to watch the sky rather than the travelers below. At the intersection of two ancient trade routes stands a clearing ringed by stones, worn smooth by centuries of feet. The locals call it Der Kreuztanzplatz, the dance of the crossroads, and they'll still warn you with half a smile never to linger there after dusk. The mainstream historical fact: in rural Europe between the 13th and 16th centuries, seasonal festivals often blended Christian and pre-Christian rites. When church bells forbade certain revels within town walls, people carried their fiddles and drums out to the crossroads, symbolic borders where the sacred met the profane. Musicologists call these gatherings the choria rusticorum, dances of the rustics, but their rhythms were far from simple. Travelers' diaries describe patterns of stamping and circling so intense the earth itself shook. Some chroniclers compared it to collective possession, noting that dancers sometimes collapsed, trembling, as if caught between laughter and prayer. Modern scholars suspect exhaustion or ergot poisoning from tainted rye. Yet here, standing among the stones, you can still feel the echo of their feet through the ground. The quirky tidbit comes from a 1478 parish record near Augsburg, in which a priest complains that villagers beat the night with their heels until the dawn confessed defeat. He confiscated their drum, a goat skin stretched over a wine cask, and swore he heard it beating on its own when locked inside the sacristy. Centuries later, folklorists rediscovered the same rhythm in local folk dances, a syncopated three-beat pulse that scholars think may represent heart, breath, and step, the biological metronome of survival. The fringe stories, whispered rather than written, claim that these crossroads dancers weren't celebrating but bargaining. The devil motif, popularized much later, was simply a metaphor for risk. To dance until you forgot your name was to trespass beyond identity, to blur into something larger. The open scholarly debate remains whether these rites were remnants of fertility cults or spontaneous communal therapy, a way to sweat fear out of the body during famine and plague. You can almost see it: villagers lighting a bonfire at the junction, shadows spinning like ink in lamplight, the air thick with smoke and sweat. As twilight gathers, you find the faint groove of a drum rhythm still etched into one of the stones, like fossilized heartbeat. You tap it once with your palm. The sound carries farther than expected. A low thump swallowed by the dusk. Wind slides through the grass, whispering in time. You remember a description from a 15th century hermit who witnessed such a dance. Their joy was like thunder, but when the drum stopped, the air shivered as if something invisible still stamped. That line stays with you now, because the same shiver moves through your bones. The science is simple: low-frequency vibration traveling through stone, but simplicity doesn't make it less alive. The music begins to form in your head: the drone of bagpipes, the high cry of a fiddle, the relentless drum beneath it all. You imagine the dancers whirling, skirts brushing the dirt, faces slick with candlelight and wine, the whole world briefly unified in rhythm. One wrong step and you're in chaos. One perfect circle and you're touching eternity. Historians argue whether these crossroads traditions influenced early trance music or whether human instinct just finds its way to the same heartbeat again and again. Either way, the ground here still remembers. You close your eyes and the pulse grows stronger, the steady triplet rhythm of feet and breath. When you open them, the bonfire is gone, but the sky above the crossroads flickers as if reflecting unseen flames. You step backward slowly, the night wrapping around you. Somewhere behind the horizon, a bell tolls the hour, its echo blending with that phantom drum. The stars seem to sway in time, faint dancers themselves. You realize that every culture invents this ritual: the need to meet at the border between safety and shadow, to test how much sound the night can hold before it bursts. You breathe once, twice in rhythm with the earth beneath your boots and feel the pulse answer. Then, as softly as it began, the vibration fades. The air grows still, the stones cool. Yet as you walk away down the moonlit road, your heart keeps that beat a while longer, unwilling to let the music die. You travel west again, through valleys folded with fog, until the road opens onto the vast silhouette of Chartres Cathedral. Even from miles away it looms like a frozen chord. Towers for bass and treble, naive for rhythm, the rose window pulsing with color like a slow heartbeat of stained glass. Step closer, and you realize this place isn't just built for worship, it's built for vibration. The mainstream historical fact. Medieval architects designed cathedrals with geometric ratios based on musical intervals, often the same proportions used in Gregorian chant. A 2-1 octave might govern the nave's height to width. A 3-2 perfect fifth might guide the tower's spacing. These were not coincidences. Builders believed a divine harmony could be embedded in stone. When choirs sang, the architecture joined in. Pilgrims wrote that the air of Chartres glowed like struck metal, as though the walls themselves were resonating. Modern acoustic engineers confirm it. These cathedrals sustain reverberations for nearly 9 seconds, long enough for notes to melt into one another like honey over bread. A quirky tidbit: an anonymous mason left a sketch hidden behind the north transept wall showing a crude harp superimposed over the cathedral's plan, each pillar a string. Some historians think it was a doodle, but others see intention, a literal blueprint for a playable building. Indeed, if you clap under the crossing vaults, the echoes return in harmonic tiers, bass frequencies rolling through the crypt, trebles spiraling toward the clerestory. A group of 21st-century researchers even tested drones emitting pure tones and discovered standing waves that align perfectly with the pattern of rose windows. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe those colored circles aren't just decorations but frozen sound waves, visual hymns carved in glass. The fringe theorists, predictably, push further. They insist that certain cathedrals acted as frequency temples, amplifying chants to induce trance or spiritual awe, an engineered holiness. They point to the limestone's quartz content, capable of slight piezoelectric vibration, and suggest that centuries of chanting literally charged the stones, storing sound the way wax stores scent. The open scholarly debate is more measured. Were medieval architects aware of these effects, or did faith simply lead intuition toward perfect acoustics? Either way, the result is undeniable. You step inside and whisper. The word takes flight, soaring upward until it disappears into the ribs of the vault, then returns a moment later, softer, kinder. It feels like being answered. The choir begins rehearsal. Low men's voices blending with high boys' tones, and within seconds, you can't tell which sound is human and which belongs to the cathedral. The organ joins, its lowest pipes vibrating the floor beneath your boots. A single sustained note fills the nave so completely that your body becomes part of it. Ribs and arches share the same frequency. Historians often describe these places as sermons in stone, but that misses the point. They're symphonies petrified mid-performance, vast instruments waiting centuries between concerts. The acoustics were never accidents. Even the labyrinth set into Chartres' floor may have functioned as a resonant pattern, a walking chant, each footstep releasing echoes in rhythm with prayer. As light shifts through the stained glass, the colors change pitch in your mind, red like cello, blue like flute, gold like bell. Standing there, you think of all those who once stood exactly where you are. Stonemasons hammering, choirs trembling, pilgrims listening for the breath of God in the hum of architecture. You breathe in, and the air itself seems tuned. When you finally leave, the door closes behind you with a sigh that resolves into the faintest chord, as if the cathedral has just exhaled your visit in gratitude. For a long moment on the steps, you still feel it humming in your bones, a reminder that some buildings don't just hold prayers, they sing them back. The train north rattles you toward Paris, its rhythm a muffled drum beneath the rain. By dusk you stand before the Basilica of Saint Denis, where France buried its kings. The facade glows under sodium light, the gargoyles wet and glittering, the air full of thunder that never quite arrives. Inside, the crypt breathes cold. Stone effigies lie in pairs, hands clasped, eyes carved open as if still waiting for the final chorus. It's here that rumor insists certain chants once woke the dead. The mainstream historical fact. The abbey's choir was renowned for its perfect intonation. In the 12th century, Abbot Suger rebuilt the church to harness divine light and divine sound alike. His masons carved resonant chambers beneath the altar so that low notes would seem to rise from the tombs themselves. Contemporary pilgrims wrote that the kings answered the psalms. Historians now know it was sub-bass reverberation, but to ears tuned by faith it sounded like response. The quirky detail buried in a later chronicle tells of a midnight mass during which candles bent sideways though no wind blew. When the choir struck a sustained E, dust cascaded from the vaults, and one acolyte swore he saw the marble mouth of Queen Blanche tremble. A miracle, said some. Vibration, say the acousticians who have measured the crypt and found a resonant frequency almost identical to the human diaphragm's natural pulse. To sing there is to make the body echo the building, the living ribcage harmonizing with stone. The fringe story, half folklore, half experiment, appeared in an 1890 newspaper. A musicologist named Jules Brevard claimed he recreated the lost chant with tuning forks and a single cello. On the final sustained note, he fainted, convinced he'd heard breathing under the floor. Modern scholars roll their eyes, yet every recording taken here carries an unexplained undertone, a whisper below 20 hertz that microphones catch but people don't consciously hear. Psychoacousticians call it infrasound, the frequency of awe and fear. The open scholarly debate wonders whether Suger's builders understood that power. Did they intend the crypt to hum like a second heart, or did faith stumble accidentally into physics? Either way, the effect remains. When the current choir rehearses, their plain chant swells until it seems to move the air in slow tides. Candles quiver, and the audience feels time loosen. You descend the narrow stair, place your hand on a sarcophagus, and the vibration passes straight through flesh into bone. Steady, measured, like the pulse of someone asleep. Perhaps that's all the miracle ever was. Not resurrection, but perfect sympathy between living breath and carved memory. You climb back into the nave, light swirling through stained glass like colored sound, and the echoes follow you out. On the steps, the thunder finally breaks, rolling over Paris in long, sonorous waves. For a moment you think the kings beneath have joined the storm, answering one last refrain. The storm escorts you out of Paris, and by dawn you're in a quiet sound studio tucked behind the Seine. Glass walls humming computers, a single microphone hanging like a relic of the old world. Here, historians and sound engineers have gathered to resurrect the past. They play you reconstructed chants, their notes sampled from cathedral recordings and fed through spectral analyzers that can strip centuries of distortion. When the first tone plays, it feels almost clinical, digital, stereo, too clean. But then the harmonics unfold, layer after layer of frequency modeled from limestone density, vaulted height, candle placement. The room trembles. You close your eyes and it's as though the stone of Saint Denis has been reborn in pixels. The mainstream historical fact. Since the 1990s, archaeologists have pioneered acoustic archaeology, recreating ancient soundscapes through 3D mapping. They've rebuilt the sonic fingerprint of sites from abbeys to caves, proving how architecture once shaped belief. A chant heard digitally through headphones still moves people to tears, not because of faith, but because the human ear recognizes resonance. It knows home when it hears it. The quirky tidbit comes from a recent project in York Minster, where researchers discovered that medieval choirs naturally tuned slightly flat, by about a quarter tone, to align with the building's echo. The mistake wasn't mistake at all. It was collaboration with the architecture. The fringe engineers of today, chasing that same magic, now build responsive rooms that shift resonance in real time, spaces that sing back. They joke about artificial intelligence replacing choirs, But even the smartest machine can't fake that trembling between breath and stone. The open scholarly debate these days isn't about demons or miracles, but data. Can digital models truly capture what the body feels? Sound, after all, isn't just heard, it's touched. Frequencies lower than 30 Hz vibrate bones, not eardrums. Maybe that's why monks once called music a living wind, because it moved through them like weather. One engineer cues up the next file. A blend of Hildegard's plain chant, bone flute, and bell resonance. The mix rises slowly until the studio disappears, replaced by an invisible cathedral. You hear the ghost of breath, the shimmer of overtones merging with sub-bass hum, the echo of hundreds of years collapsing into one continuous tone. It's beautiful and terrifying sound without source, faith without face. Someone jokes that ghosts finally have good microphones. You laugh, but your eyes sting. Perhaps the ancients weren't wrong to believe that music could summon spirits. Perhaps it simply summons memory. The air, after all, remembers everything ever said within it. When the playback ends, the silence feels almost obscene. The engineer turns off the monitor, and for a heartbeat, the room still vibrates, though no sound plays. You realize that resonance lingers longer in the body than in the air, that we carry echoes like fossils. As you step outside, the city hums faintly with traffic, sirens, voices, modern music everywhere, yet beneath it all runs that same medieval undertone, the low pulse of creation still tuning itself note by note. You take a night train north through rain-smeared windows, the landscape flashing in ghostly fragments, fields, spires, the glow of distant factories. Somewhere between stations, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels begins to sound like a chant, a mechanical plainsong repeating the same phrase until it dissolves into silence. That silence, you realize, is the oldest music of all. The mainstream historical fact. By the late Middle Ages, theologians and composers alike began to speak of musica reservata, reserved music pieces, written not to be performed but contemplated. The rest between notes was sacred, a moment of divine suspension where listeners were meant to imagine the sound continuing in heaven. The earliest surviving examples are single lines of notation, followed by pages of empty staves. Scholars debate whether these were unfinished drafts or deliberate invitations to silence. Whatever the intent, it marks the birth of musical minimalism centuries before the word existed. The quirky tidbit surfaces from a 15th-century sermon by the mystic Johannes Tauler, who told his congregation that the most perfect song is the one you never hear. To him, silence wasn't absence but completion, the point where the human ear could finally rest in God's own unspoken frequency. Later copyists took him literally, illuminating blank pages with gold leaf, each one a gilded pause. Modern musicians sometimes reproduce them as conceptual scores, whole concerts where performers raise their instruments but never play. Critics call it provocation. Monks once called it prayer. The fringe theorists stretch further, proposing that silence itself can leave measurable residue, that even unplayed intervals shape brainwaves. Neuroscientists testing medieval chants have found that the moment after sound stops triggers the brain's calmest state, the auditory equivalent of an exhale. Perhaps that's why cloisters were built with so much air between stones, architecture designed to hold the pause. You think back to all the sounds that brought you here, the drones, the flutes, the bells that rang themselves, and realize every one of them depended on silence to survive. Without the space between notes, there's no rhythm, no meaning, no rest. You step off the train at a rural stop, the platform empty except for a single lamp buzzing faintly. Beyond the tracks, the fields stretch dark and endless, and somewhere out there an owl calls once, then stops. The quiet that follows feels vast enough to hold the entire history of sound. The open scholarly debate remains philosophical. Is silence the absence of music or its culmination? Some argue it's where emotion hides when words fail. Others say it's the proof that creation was always self-sustaining, humming quietly even when no one listens. You stand under the weak yellow light and breathe. In that breath you hear your heartbeat and realize that even silence has rhythm. The pulse of blood, the soft crackle of rain on your coat, the whisper of distant electricity. Everything sings, even stillness. When the wind shifts, you almost expect a faint chord to rise again. The afterglow of every story you followed, vibrating gently just beyond hearing. But nothing comes, and that nothing feels perfect. For the first time, you understand why the monks left those pages blank. In the gap between sound and silence, the soul finally learns to listen. You wake before dawn in a countryside inn, the windows fogged from your breath, the air faintly metallic with rain. Somewhere in the distance a church bell tolls, muffled by mist. Each strike hangs a little longer than the one before, dissolving into the quiet until you're not sure where the sound ends or if it simply becomes part of the morning. You dress, step outside, and follow the bell through the pale light to a small abbey crouched beside a stream. The water runs low and murmuring, its rhythm steady, ageless. You realize this is how music began, not in cathedrals or courts but in the steady repetition of the world itself, the hiss of wind through grass, the pulse of water over stone, the hush between heartbeats. You enter the chapel, empty except for a single candle trembling at the altar. The stone smells faintly of wax and moss, and as you breathe, the air hums around you, the faintest resonance born from your own chest. The monks here are long gone, but the building remembers. When you whisper, your voice returns a heartbeat later, softened as if another version of you lingers in the walls. The mainstream historical fact: this abbey once served as a resting stop for pilgrims traveling to Compostela, where singers would test new hymns against the acoustics of every chapel they passed. Over time, they discovered that no song ever sounded the same twice. Humidity, temperature, even the listener's position could change the entire harmony. Music, like faith, was alive, imperfect, breathing, capable of surprise. The quirky tidbit buried in a travel diary from 1480 records. One pilgrim who claimed that when he sang alone at dawn, the echo began to answer in words he hadn't yet spoken. Scholars blame pareidolia, the mind finding pattern in randomness, but you prefer the thought that sound itself wanted conversation. You sit on a wooden bench, eyes half closed, listening to the echo fade. Outside, birds begin to stir. Sparrows, doves, the small rustle of wings. Each chirp folds neatly into the resonance still quivering in the chapel, nature harmonizing with memory. The fringe theory that once sounded foolish, that the world is a single vibrating chord, suddenly feels self-evident. Every atom, every drop of rain, every whisper hums at its own frequency, and together they form a music too vast for human hearing. The open scholarly debate among theologians and physicists now asks the same question in different language: is the universe still singing the note it began with? Some say the cosmic background radiation is exactly that, an ancient hymn stretched thin by time, humming quietly beneath reality. You stand, the candle's flame bending in the draught, and hum a single note. It's small, imperfect, trembling with sleep. The chapel answers immediately, folding your tone into a warm echo that lasts just long enough to remind you that you're part of something immense. Slowly you step outside. The world smells of wet grass and wood smoke, the stream whispering its endless refrain. The wind moves through the trees in slow chords, and every sound seems tuned to the same key, major or minor. You can't tell, only that it's whole. You walk down the road until the abbey shrinks behind you, its bell ringing one final time. The sound floats over the hills, widening, softening, until it becomes impossible to separate from the hush that follows. The sun lifts, gold and gentle, over fields washed clean by rain. You breathe in the morning air and realize that the music has never stopped. It simply changes listener. The tone continues in the water, the wind, the slow murmur of your own pulse, an eternal resonance threading every life, every silence, every ending. The rhythm slows, the world exhales, and the sound fades into stillness, smooth as a lullaby's last breath. Sweet dreams.